So earlier this year, everyone was hyped when they heard that Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz, the main eventers from UFC 244 back in 2019, were finally going to throw down in June. But instead of duking it out in the UFC, they're taking their beef to the boxing ring under the promotion Fan Mio. But this whole moving the rivalry outside the UFC, it's not exactly new. There have been other big UFC feuds that ended up getting settled in different promotions. In this video, let's check out 5 of those major UFC rivalries that spilled over into other leagues. Coming in at number 5, we've got Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. Let's be honest, Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz, their rivalry straight up legendary in the octagon. These two heavyweight giants threw down not once, but twice, and both times, Chuck knocked Tito out cold. Round 1 went down in 2004, with the Iceman putting Ortiz away in the second round. Then, in 2006, they went at it again, and Chuck had to dig deep, needing an extra round to finish Tito Ortiz. The UFC even tried to set up a third match in 2010, but Ortiz had to tap out due to a back issue, leaving their beef kinda hanging. Now, let's fast forward to 2018, and Liddell's been retired for ages. Ortiz is halfway out the door himself, and suddenly they're back at it, this time under Golden Boy MMA banner. Now, let's be real, it sounded sketchy from the jump. Both dudes were past their prime, and when they finally faced off, Chuck Liddell was knocked out in the first round. But even in victory and finally beating Chuck, Tito Ortiz didn't exactly look like a champ either. As for the event, it was a total flop on pay-per-view. Talk about a letdown compared to their UFC days. At number 4, we've got Don Frye and Mark Coleman. Alright, let's take it back to the old school days of the UFC. Way before MMA was even a thing and you just had madmen in the cage fighting each other. First up, Don Frye. This dude was ahead of his time. I'm talking high-level wrestling and a killer boxing game. They called him the Predator for a reason. And when UFC 8 rolled around, he cleaned house, beating everyone. But then, cue Mark Coleman, the wrestling powerhouse. Sure, he wasn't exactly a boxing whiz like Frye, but he made up for it with pure muscle and technique. Coleman straight up bullied Frye in their showdown, taking the crown as the king of the octagon. Now, Frye wasn't exactly thrilled about taking that L. Even after snagging the Ultimate title in 1996, he couldn't lock down a rematch with Coleman in the UFC. Their rivalry just kept simmering until 2003 in Japan under the Pride banner. But here's the kicker. Even after waiting 7 long years for his shot at payback, Frye couldn't quite pull it off. He ended up taking another loss against the Hammer. This time, it wasn't as brutal as the first time around. Number 3, we've got Tim Sylvia versus Andrei Arlovski. Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovski pretty much owned the UFC heavyweight scene back in the mid-2000s. These two behemoths went head-to-head 3 times in the octagon, swapping the heavyweight title back and forth in a couple of intense one-round shutdowns. But let's be real, their third bout was a total snooze fest. It was like watching paint dry. It did nothing for Sylvia's rep as a top-tier fighter and didn't do Arlovski any favors either. In fact, they both left the UFC not long after. Skip to 2012, and for some reason, One Championship thought it was a genius move to set up a 4th fight between these guys. I mean, sure, Arlovski was making a comeback, but Sylvia? Dude pushing 300 pounds and definitely past his prime. But hey, one went for it anyway, and you gotta hand it to them. The fight was way more exciting than their last one. It all went down in the second round when the Pitbull unleashed a combo followed by a couple of soccer kicks to Sylvia's head. Yeah, those kicks were ruled illegal later on, turning the match into a no contest. But hey, at least it saved us from another round of a snooze fest rivalry. Number 2, we've got Quentin Rampage Jackson versus Wanderlei Silva. So here's the deal with Wanderlei Silva and Quentin Rampage Jackson. Their beef didn't even start in the UFC. These two went toe-to-toe in the Pride ring, and let me tell you, it was pure chaos. Silva knocked Rampage out not once, but twice, with some brutal knees and kicks. Jump to 2008, they're both big names in the UFC, and Jackson even held the light heavyweight title for a minute. But after his loss to Forrest Griffin, the UFC decided it was rematch time. Rampage was out for revenge, and he got it, knocking Silva out cold with a nasty left hook in the first round. The bad blood didn't exactly disappear. A decade later, Bellator MMA threw them back in the ring for round 4. By this point, they're both past their prime and fighting in the heavyweight division. The fight was kind of sad to watch, but Rampage managed to seal the deal with a big right hand in the second round, tying up their rivalry at 2-2. The Axe Murderer called it quits after that, officially hanging up his gloves in 2022, while Rampage last stepped in the cage in 2019. Here's to hoping this feud stays tied up for good. Last on the list, we've got Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie. Let's go back to the early days of the UFC, where the spotlight was on the epic showdown between Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock. These two squared off in the very first UFC event. Gracie got the upper hand, locking Shamrock up in a chokehold and scoring the first of his 3 tournament wins. But Shamrock wasn't able to let it slide. He was itching for a rematch. After missing out on a rematch at UFC 3 due to injuries, the UFC set up a special super fight just for them. This thing went on for 36 minutes and ended in a draw. Talk about a nail-biter. Opinions were split on the fight. Some thought it was a snooze fest, while others held it as a tactical masterpiece. But hey, at least it seemed to squash the beef between these two. No. Fast forward to 2003, and both Shamrock and Gracie were honored as the first inductees into the UFC Hall of Fame. It was a fitting end to their epic saga, or so we thought. Come 2016, retirement should have been on the cards for both, so you can imagine the shock when Bellator MMA announced a trilogy fight between them. Gracie at 50 hadn't fought in nearly a decade, while Shamrock at 52 was looking pretty bad as well. Seriously, who thought this was a good idea? The fight itself, a total mess. Gracie seemed to land a low blow, but the ref let it slide, leading to a TKO win for Gracie. Shamrock was rightfully pissed off. Thankfully, even Bellator realized another bout would have been a disaster, and almost a decade later, neither of these two legends have stepped back into the ring. And honestly, that might be for the best. On June 1st, Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz will face off again, but this time, the BMF belt will not be on the line and the UFC will not be promoting it. Both fighters are past their prime and looking to make a good payday. Thanks for watching this video, and be sure to subscribe and check out our next video.